On the Line, a different kind of episode than normal, bit of a format mix up here. Not unusual for me to have multiple guests in an episode, but normally we do a longer conversation and then follow it with a specific update on something. Flipping the script today, we want to tell you right at the outset in a short interview about an event that's coming up in Toronto this week, and I think it's an event a lot of you are going to want to hear about, probably haven't heard about, but it might be something you are interested in because it's a way to help military families in this country, and this is something I don't think Canadians are great at. We're not terrible at it, and we're better than we used to be, but we could be better. And there's something happening this week that I want you to know about because it's an opportunity to maybe actually do some of that work for people who really deserve it, our military families, particularly those who've lost a service member in the line of duty or afterward from injuries they never quite healed from. So that conversation with Anthony Robb of Canada Company is first this week. It's brief, but there's an event coming up and I wanted you to hear about it. After that, a longer conversation with Peter Jones. He's a professor of international relations at the University of Ottawa and wrote earlier in the summer a fascinating article in The Walrus that I think a lot of Canadians aren't going to like. It is about what we are and what we're not and how that's going to conflict a little bit with our self-image. So stick around for both those great guests. It's another episode of On the Line. This episode is brought to you by BioCanRx. Through our partnership with federally funded Canadian not-for-profit BioCanRx this summer, we're talking about potential solutions to the problems that are limiting Canada's ability to domestically develop new drugs, especially immunotherapies for cancer. Today, Canada's biomanufacturing capacity. A biomanufacturing industry, like any other industry, does not appear at the swipe of a bureaucrat's pen. Simply allocating money to a new economic development program doesn't replace the years of effort necessary to help a sector put down lasting roots. The good news, Canada already has many building blocks in place. For example, infrastructure developed for pandemic readiness after COVID and money invested in research facilities across Canada can be leveraged to give us a head start, but they need to be coordinated and given steady work. BioCanRx supports core Canadian biomanufacturing facilities and connects them with active Canadian research projects, making sure both sides have resources and the chance to gain experience. But more activity is needed to ensure these facilities can build up expertise, maintain readiness, and foster innovation. Building this capacity can position Canada to develop new drugs more quickly and be ready for a health emergency, all while delivering products to Canadian patients today. There are promising paradigm shifts on the horizon that could change the way we manufacture biologic products like immunotherapies. More on that next week. Visit biocanrx.com to learn more. Anthony Robb, thanks for being here with me. I always get awkward about introducing people and sharing their biographies because I'm never going to do as good a job as you will. So tell us about yourself, just briefly here. Who are you? What have you done? And what are you doing now?
Hey, my name's Anthony. I spent 24 years in the Canadian Army, and now I'm the managing director for Canada Company, Many Ways to Serve. And to summarize what we do, we are an enduring and trusted bridge that links Canadian society with their military.
I wish I lived in a country where it wasn't so important to do that. And at times of our history and in some of our allied countries, people don't need to be connected to their military. The military is part of civic life. There are people who go through it. Everybody knows someone who's been in, or everyone, maybe national service. They'll end up serving a year or two themselves. Bases are co-located with large population centers. Canada isn't that. Canada's military has always been small, expeditionary, and largely stood down in peacetime. There are a lot of Canadians, Anthony, who actually have no direct, tangible connection to the Canadian Armed Forces in their own personal lives. Maybe their grandpa was in a war or something like that. But I remember the first time I actually saw a Canadian soldier in real life. I was a teenager. When you do this work, what are you trying to do? What are you actually hoping people understand about the armed forces?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I would offer a couple things. One, All of us, we're probably not as far removed from the military as we might think we are. If you don't know somebody that's served or has served in the Canadian Armed Forces, you're probably only one or two connections away from somebody who does or who has served. I mean, even here in Toronto, I've heard it said that, this isn't a military city. I mean, in fact, there are about 3,500 Army reservists who live in Toronto, and there's a Naval Reserve unit in the city as well. So I mean, Toronto and like many other cities, I mean, these are military cities with a strong military presence. So I mean, we are not as far away from this, even though it might not be as much in our face as say in other countries. And secondly, I would offer that that the military exists to serve Canada. I mean, soldiers, sailors, and aviators. I mean, they are here for Canadians, and I think that connection is important, and it's important to stress and to preserve. And so, as you might expect, your tax dollars pay for the ships and the paychecks and the submarines and the jets and so forth. But there are some things that our tax dollars can't pay for. There are some gaps, some shortcomings where organizations like ours can step in, whether they be for unique support requirements, for individual needs, or perhaps they're to facilitate events where industry leaders can get together and learn more about what the military does. There are functions that quite simply the existing official channels can't do, but where we can. And that's why we exist. And that's why we call ourselves the bridge between Canadian society and the Canadian Armed Forces.
Your organization, Canada Company, does a lot of memorial work. They teach or they work to promote and teach Canadian military history. You have worked to have monuments installed in different parts of the country. But you and I did know Canada Company before you and I began speaking a few weeks ago. But
Mhm.
one of the things that I did not know about Canada Company was the work you have done with families of service members. In this context, service members who've lost their lives. And as you explained to me last week when you and I last spoke, some of these losses are Canadian personnel who've fallen in battle. Others have been lost in training accidents and related workplace hazards, and others are those who lost their battle with mental health problems after their service. And you guys take them all on an equal basis. Coming up this week, you guys have a ceremony, and
Yes.
unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to attend. I'm needed elsewhere on the home front at that time. But it's an incredible thing. Tell me a little bit what you guys have coming up in Toronto this week.
Yeah, you bet. So this ceremony is part of our Children of the Fallen Scholarship, and this was actually one of the very first things that we started doing here at Canada Company 20 years ago. You might recall it was a time in Afghanistan. Casualties are coming back to Canada, making their way down the Highway of Heroes. Our founder and some others thought, there's got to be something we can do, because when a soldier, a sailor, an aviator, when they die, obviously there's an emotional impact on the family, but there's also a financial one as well. And some of the children of these fallen may wish to go to college or university or trade school after they finish high school, but the loss of a parent, I mean, that financial impact may preclude that from happening. So this scholarship is a way to address that gap, that need. And so every year we invite any child who has lost a parent due to military service to apply to the scholarship. And as long as they meet the criteria, which is pursuing education post high school and having lost a parent, we'll award them a $5,000 scholarship for every year they're in university for up to 4 years, and then another 2 years if they want to do graduate studies. And as a way to make this scholarship extra special, we invite all of them to come to Toronto for a ceremony where we can hand them the scholarship. And also, it provides an opportunity for these children to come together. As you might expect, they all share a shared experience that other kids simply wouldn't understand. And so the opportunity to bring them together where they can meet one another is a very special added component to this ceremony. In fact, it is so important that, and we've been doing this for a while, some of the children have formed an alumni group to allow them to maintain those relationships and those connections going forward as they become adults. So all that's happening this Thursday here in Toronto, And we're looking very much forward to welcoming this year's scholarship recipients and the alumni that are coming to join them.
When you were telling me about this originally, Anthony, the thing that jumped out at me isn't just the real tangible impact, helping someone with their education, particularly in a family where one of the parents has been lost, and the financial impact that has, and just the logistics impact that has on a family. Yeah. But when you mentioned to me, and I hadn't really thought about it until you mentioned it to me, but how isolating and alienating it must be for a kid to lose their parents in that particular circumstance. And there are others, I suppose, across the country who've had a similar thing. And there are other kinds of family tragedies that are broadly similar. You know, when a first responder passes away, there's often similar kind of gratitude in the community. But it fades. And you spend your whole life hearing about how brave your mom and dad was, but they're not there. And what it must mean for them to meet someone who gets it, and how hard that must be, because it's obviously a wonderful thing that in this country that it has been many generations since we've had mass casualties during military operations, and that's great. But how lonely it must be to be one of the unlucky few.
Yeah, that's a fantastic observation, and that's why these ceremonies are so powerful, because these kids come together and they can find comfort in one another because of the shared experience.
Tell me a little bit, just for a minute, about the ceremony itself. How is that? Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to be there, but for these kids, I can imagine it must be intimidating, but also I hope some way gratifying, just to be reminded that their parent isn't forgotten.
Yeah, we try and make it as comfortable for the children as possible. And the ceremony is pretty straightforward. I mean, we don't overdo it. The kids will arrive. We have some of our Canada Company, let's say Canada Company family, the people who have been with us for a while. They'll come out and attend the event. There'll be some remarks from our founder, Mr. Blake Goldring. There'll be some remarks from a VIP guest. This year we have a retired 3-star general joining us. And, it's special for him and for our the military members that come too. And I can speak to this personally, having spent a lot of time in the Army. I'm seeing children receive this scholarship where I knew and served with their parent. So I know, like I knew them when they were younger. And now to see their children, their legacy getting this scholarship, it's very much a full circle moment. And I know that our military guests and our VIPs, they feel the same way, because they're seeing like the children of their military colleagues come get this. So that's another heartwarming aspect to this ceremony. Anyway, they're going to come, they get their scholarship after remarks. We're going to have one of our scholarship recipients from the past also offer some remarks to talk about how the scholarship and how this program has served them over the last 20 years. And we'll hand out the checks, and then it'll be done. So it's very straightforward, but it's a very powerful hour, that's for sure.
Anthony, one last question for you here,
Sure.
And I really appreciate your time. Where can people find out more? How can they learn more about the scholarships, the recipients, and the organization and the work you're doing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the scholarship program is one of the many things we do. We have about 15 programs that directly support the Canadian Armed Forces in one way or another, or veterans or military families. To learn more, or to see what you can do through us, just go to canadacompany.ca.
Thank you. I hope it's a great ceremony. I truly wish I could be there. I'm hoping next year in different circumstances, I might be able to attend in person. So we'll stay in touch on that. But for now, thanks to you, thanks to Canada Company, and my heart goes out to these kids. I'm glad someone remembers.
Thanks for your interest, Matt. Really appreciate it.
This episode is also brought to you by the Forest Products Association of Canada. Canada's resilience will not be built through diversified trade and good intentions alone. It will be built with strong domestic supply chains, reliable Canadian materials, and industries that invest in workers and communities here at home. 2 months ago, the federal government acknowledged the Forest Sector Transformation Task Force report and the practical path it set out. Now the focus must be action. Canada's forest products sector can help deliver the homes, infrastructure, and economic potential the country needs. But that requires predictable access to manage our forests, transportation systems that work, and a regulatory environment that rewards investment rather than delays it. The direction is clear. Now Ottawa needs to turn recognition into results. Learn more at fpac.ca. That was Anthony Robb from Canada Company. He is a 24-year veteran of the Canadian Army, now working as a managing director at Canada Company. Check them out, canadacompany.ca. Learn about the programs they do, including the scholarships for the kids who lost one of their parents in service of this country. That's a debt that never ends, folks, and I don't think as Canadians we're doing enough. So let's try and do better. Coming up in a moment, as promised, Peter Jones is here from the University of Ottawa. He's a professor of international relations there, the author recently of an article in The Walrus about, well, I'll let him explain it, but let's just say he is gently slaughtering perhaps a sacred cow in Canadian politics. Stick around. That's right after this, right here. It's On the Line. Peter Jones, great to have him here with me. And Peter, I confess a little bit wryly that this is take two for you and I. We had a dress rehearsal earlier today, and then the tech gods intervened. So I hope we saved some of our wisdom and charm for what will be us sticking the landing here. But I wanted to talk with Peter because I read him a couple of weeks ago in The Walrus, the magazine, where he wrote an essay that I thought was obnoxiously smart. And it was annoying me when I was reading it, Peter, because you finally described in words something that I'd been feeling intuitively, which is that all of Canada's talk about being a middle power or leading the middle powers and the middle powers coming together, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, was kind of weird. And the reason it was kind of weird is because I'm not sure we're a middle power. And you aren't writing this in any way disparagingly. You're not like knocking Canada, but you were talking about the term middle power and what it means and what it doesn't mean. So I'm going to encourage everybody to go read your essay at The Walrus, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But for our purposes here, what is your argument? What do you think is the case against Canada being a middle power?
Well, this term middle power, it really came up during the Cold War. And it described a very particular set of events in a very particular state that we were in at that time. And essentially, it described a country that was not in the middle in terms of the Cold War. We were firmly on the Western side, no question. But we were in the middle in other ways in terms of things like the United Nations and the Commonwealth. And really, it described a kind of international good citizenship, a country that sort of played by the rules and encouraged others to do so, and encouraged a sort of a more fair system, and worked at the margins to make the system work for everybody. And so this was a sort of a role that we played, and most famously, of course, peacekeeping was something that we did a lot of at that time. But it only really worked because of two things. First of all, because there was this international system centered around the UN and other multilateral institutions, which really was possible because the United States supported it and really pushed it. And secondly, we were a friend of the United States, and therefore we had this trusted position to do these things and to be helpful at the margins. Well, right now the United States is tearing the international system apart as fast as it can, and our friendship with them is pretty, shaky at best. So I just don't think that situation really applies anymore.
I remember it was a couple of years ago now. I was at a conference, and it was I forget the gentleman's name. He spoke publicly. I could quote him. I just can't remember the damn guy's name, but he was a senior Australian intelligence official, and he was on a panel discussion kind of talking about the international order. And he made this really elegant point that I've thought a lot about since. And it's not too far removed from the point you're making, because you're talking about how the term middle power is being misapplied here. He said that for generations, there's been talk about a rules-based international order. And there are whole institutions and think tanks that have kind of come up around it. But he says what we did, to our misfortune, is we mislabeled it. because it wasn't a rules-based international order. It was a benign American hegemonic military enforced order. And the Americans, since the Second World War, kind of had this attitude of, we're going to run the world, or at least our part of it during the Cold War, in a way that's fairly benign, and friendly for our friends and good for commerce and free trade and freedom of navigation and all those things. But then in the last decade-ish, with some interruptions, they basically decided not only to stop propping it up, but that it had been a bad idea. And where that leaves countries like us is weird. And I think something that you were writing about, I thought really elegant, Peter, was the idea that middle power describes your location more than your stature. Because Canada actually is a very rich country. Like in terms of our economic power, our GDP and things like that, we're not a middle power. We're actually an upper tier power. But in terms of our hard power, our military, our diplomacy, we're not particularly advanced here. What the hell is Canada? If we're not a middle power, what are we?
I think we're all trying to figure that out. And I don't think the answer is clear yet. I mean, I think if you look at Canada's position in the world, if we weren't in North America, we'd be a great regional power. It's a great sort of irony that we're sort of, by any stretch of the imagination, as you say, we're one of the major countries of the world, G7 and all the rest of it. And so we tend to think of ourselves as being a small country, but we're not. And so, we're not in the middle in the sense of, if you look at sort of the ranking of world countries, we're at the very top. We're one of the top 1%. I think if you look at who's our comparators around the world, it's probably in many ways the Scandinavians, the Nordics, those sorts of countries in terms of the kind of social model we have and the kind of diplomacy we project around the world. The problem is that, whereas they are in Europe and therefore their reference point is Europe and they're part of the European Union and we're in North America, we really only have one neighbor. And it's a neighbor that outranks us or outweighs us in every way. And therefore, we're in a slightly funny position.
That funny position, first of all, you're right. If Canada, Mark Carney's been talking about Canada being, the most European, non-European country. If we actually were a European country, we'd be up there. Like we would be in the tier of Spain or Italy, probably not quite France, UK, or Germany, but kind of just maybe one rung down from them. We would be a big, rich, populous country. But then you put us next to the United States and we're a pipsqueak. We're the mouse in bed with the elephant, to quote another prime minister. And one of the things that I find fascinating, and I mentioned this to you earlier in our dress rehearsal, is that I envy the Europeans their Europeanness. Because if the Western Alliance or whatever we want to call the damn thing does come apart, they have a standby identity. Okay, well, we're not going to be transatlanticists or Westerners anymore. We'll just be Europeans. I don't know what Canadians are going to be. And I think you were saying a minute ago that we're trying to figure that out here. We used to be really good at leveraging our special relationship with the Americans. And I know that's a term the British prefer to use, but we could say to the Europeans, hey, talk to us, we'll work it out with them. Like we could be a go-between in both directions. Now, these days, I don't think we're a go-between. I just think we're locked in a room with a psycho.
Yeah, I mean, I think, going back to your point about the Europeans, I agree with you. What they really have is they have a trading bloc. I mean, their reliance on the U.S. economy is, nothing like ours. And therefore, it would hurt if they were divorced from the United States economically, but they would survive. For us, it's a different matter. I mean, I think we'd still survive. And I think we sometimes get ourselves tied up in knots about, if free trade doesn't work, what will we be? We lived for years before free trade. We would continue to live. We will trade with the United States, whether there's a free trade agreement. But I think where we are is that we need to stitch together a kind of a constellation of countries with whom we can do business, with whom we can have diplomacy, with whom we can have some military relationships, which not to replace the United States. We can't do that, but to be a counterweight to it. And if the American, reality diminishes for Canada in terms of our trade and so on, at least to give us another option to sort of keep going. And I think that's really what we're trying to do. And so when you look at the countries we're talking about and the countries we're working with, they're really the countries of Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the sort of the democratic, rich countries of the world. And that's our natural sort of alliance, or I wouldn't use the word alliance militarily, but it's our natural set of relationships, and it's nowhere but near the middle. It's the wealthy 1%. And that's our home. And that's where we need to find ways to work with these countries, which is, I think, what Mr. Carney's trying to do.
And then you've drawn an elegant line between economic and military power, because Canada 100% is top tier economic power. There are a lot of countries that are much, much smaller and poorer than ours that would absolutely kick our ass in a war, because for their geopolitical strategic reasons, they've had to invest in the military. Every once in a while, I look at what the air fleets are in your typical Mideastern kingdom and I gulp. There are a lot of countries out there that are just in a very different strategic neighborhood, and they govern themselves accordingly. So Canada's kind of a weird country in that way, in which we could be much more powerful than we are, and we might have to become. And this is an interesting question to pose, kind of to flip the script here a little bit. If Canada is not a middle power, who is? What are countries these days sort of in this new alignment that would constitute a middle power? I can think of a couple, but I'm curious to get your thoughts first. I agree with you. It's probably not us. Who do you think would qualify? Who should Mark Carney call up and go, hey man, you're running it now. You're the middle power leader.
There's been a lot of work on this. Various scholars and the Belfer Center at Harvard has done work on this. And they really identify a kind of a constellation of countries like South Africa, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, countries that are sort of powers in their regions, that have a certain international standing, and that in many ways do play the middle role between the United States and China and Russia and other countries. And so that's kind of the new emerging group of middle powers, at which sort of international relations scholars talk about. It's not Canada, it's not Europe, it's not Australia. That's really what we're talking about. If I could just go back to your military point, because it's an important one. We were once a great military power. We had the fourth largest navy in the world and all the rest of it. And during the early years of NATO, we were one of the larger military powers in NATO. We gave that up. We decided we didn't need it. To some extent, because of our talk of being a middle power, we sort of deluded ourselves in the era of Trudeau the Elder into thinking, well, we go peacekeeping. We don't need, military forces in Europe and that kind of thing. So I think you're right. We are going to need to invest in the military. We are investing in the military quite significantly, but we need to be smart in the sense that no one's going to attack us except our neighbor to the south. And if they did, that's a different matter entirely. Where we need to be able to do is to work with other countries that are like-minded, to support them, to work with them, and to show that, we're worthy of being a first-class trading partner to them, which is what we want from countries like Europe and Japan. And we have a contribution to make. And we can do that by being intelligent in terms of what we buy and what we operate. Probably less American stuff, probably more stuff that will work with other countries, which isn't to say completely divorcing ourselves from the Americans militarily, but being a little more clever about it.
Yeah, my colleague here, Jen Gerson, in one of our recent episodes, actually was speaking with a NATO expert on exactly that interoperability issue, right? And there are certain things that right now only the United States can do. And okay, we're like, I got to tell you, Peter, I do not have a GPS analog in my shed ready to go, right? And there are, the Europeans are talking about building their own cruise missiles because of shortfalls in Tomahawk cruise missiles. Also a little bit of strategic autonomy that they're certainly suddenly very interested in, so on and so forth. So I'm with you. Buy from America when America is the only option, and buy from anyone else when they're an equally good option. That would be what my strategy would be, or make stuff at home,
and work with others, to develop options.
Yep.
Not just buy, but work with.
I
think that's going to be a key part of this.
Wonder what we'd call a Canadian-built Tomahawk. Maybe we should have a poll that we can run on that. When we look at kind of these other middle powers. You mentioned Saudi Arabia, and I would agree that the Saudi Arabia was very much on my list just because the role they're playing in the Middle East right now, kind of not necessarily as the militarily dominant country. I think that's pretty clearly Israel, but they're the one that's able to work with everyone in the region, even the Israelis, which is new. But the Saudis are a fascinating go-between between the United States and basically everybody else. And sometimes it's friendly, and sometimes they're joining the U.S. and bombing somebody, but they're a go-to power. An interesting one, and they're kind of truculent and hard to work with, but are the Turks. I find them fascinating. The role they're playing is really, really interesting, trying to become a regional power again. And I'm interested as well in, and I don't know to what extent they're willing to play nicely together, but I'm fascinated by South Korea and Japan because, obviously a lot of bad blood between them historically, but they also have a lot of things in common. And I'm genuinely curious to see which of one of those things ends up prevailing because geostrategically, they ought to be very close allies. They're still kind of stuck in their faulty towers. Don't mention the war phase. So maybe they're going to have to get over that eventually. Canada, I don't know where the hell we plug into that. And, I do think in a weird way, maybe Prime Minister Carney has it about right. I think when he says things like we're the most European, non-European nation, I die a little bit inside. I think that's pretty cringy. But in terms of where we ought to be aligning ourselves, it might actually be Europe, because I don't think like the Japanese might want some of our lumber or energy. Certainly they want our energy, but I don't really think anyone is looking to Canada to come save them. We might need the Europeans more than they need us.
Well, I don't think we should foreclose any possibilities. I think there are, trade relationships with Japan and South Korea could be very important. And we do have resources that they want. And so I think, we shouldn't foreclose that. But in terms of, I don't know how you put it culturally, whatever you want to say, I mean, right now, yes, probably Europe is the sort of the closer fit, if you like. But again, I don't think we should foreclose anything. In terms of who needs who, I mean, you can spin this off into some pretty dire scenarios. Trump invades Greenland or, invades Canada or whatever. I mean, then you're in a sort of a world where a lot of this conversation is sort of moot, right? But I mean, presuming that where we are now is sort of where we're going to be, the U.S. is unpredictable, it's bullying, it's threatening, it's upending the economic order. In that case, if that's the sort of situation that continues, then I think, yeah, we do need these other countries to come together, and we need to be part of that, to have again, as I say, the ability to have a counterweight or a counterbalance to our dependence on the United States right now.
I want to talk with you a little bit, Peter, about the United States, because there's an essay I've been working on, and by the time this airs, it probably will have been published already. And if so, I'll drop a link to your Walrus article into the notes for this, but I'll try to remember to drop, if it's live, I'll try to drop my own damn essay into it. One of the fascinating things about dealing with the United States right now is how clearly under the skin Mark Carney got for the president and senior administration officials. And I found that fascinating. And I don't even say that in a boastful way. Like, I'm not saying this to mock the Americans. I'm just intrigued. But the Davos speech clearly really bothered them. And President Trump, in his own Davos remarks back in January, he called out Mark Carney by name. Remember that, Mark, when you make your statements, a very dismissive message.
You exist because of us. Yeah.
Yeah. And Pete Hegseth at the NATO ministerial meeting a couple months ago, he didn't name Carney or Canada, but he went off on how some of NATO's richest countries are still military free riders, and they like to talk about middle powers, but they're not willing to pull their weight. Oh, I knew who that was in regards to. I wish I could tell him he was wrong, or at least traditionally had been wrong, but he's not. But I still thought it was interesting. And then very recently, Colby Elbridge, or no, other way around, Elbridge Colby.
Elbridge Colby.
Yeah, is Undersecretary of War for the United States. And a guy who has talked a couple of times in public statements. Once was a Twitter thread that he just published out of the blue on his own account, and another was an interview with Ross Douthat of the New York Times, where he really had some negative things to say about the whole middle power strategy. And I just find it really fascinating because I joked with you earlier, but the Americans have slammed the door in the faces of their allies, and now they're really happy we're not all in the same room together. Like, they're going to have to kind of pick a side here, and I don't know what the Americans want. They say to us, we're not picking up your tab anymore. You got to go stand on your own. And we go, oh, okay. And they go, well, hang on, wait a minute. Not like that. So what do you think the Americans are up to here? Like, you study international relations, international affairs. I have my theory, and I'll tell it to you in a minute, but I want to hear your version of it first. What the hell are the Americans doing?
I think that they themselves don't know entirely. And there are many different threads, and we tend to think that there's a well thought out strategy, and there may well not be. And so what you've correctly identified is a very strange situation where they're sort of saying, you got to go stand on your own. You got to stand on your own 2 feet. We're not going to be there anymore. We're not necessarily going to come over the hill for you if the Russians attack Europe and this and that. But you got to buy American stuff, and you got to play with us, and you got to train with us, and you got to support us. And it's a kind of a schizophrenic situation that we have. And I think that, Trump is erratic. I mean, I think that's a polite way of saying it. And, he wants this, and then he wants that, and then he wants this again. And so you have to sort of put that in the mix. I mean, I think in broad terms where the Americans are going has to do with a sort of a sense that has taken hold in the United States that its allies have been free riders. There's some truth in that. It's not unfair. And they've propped up this system which has not benefited America. There's really little truth in that. The Americans have benefited from the system. They just prefer not to recognize it right now. And therefore something has to change. But I think that if you ask Americans what has to change, you'll get many different answers. And that's the kind of stage we're in now. And I think that's part of what we have to navigate through.
You know what? You and I actually, in our earlier dress rehearsal interview that got derailed by technical issues, we hadn't talked about this. So I was fascinated to hear your answer, because you and I are almost in lockstep in our thinking. And, my way of describing it is that there probably are different factions of either institutional America, the State Department, the Pentagon, various agencies that are forward facing to the world. Then there is the traditional Republican Party. There's the Democratic Party, to what extent they currently hold influence. And it's not much, but it's also not zero. And then you have the MAGA movement, which is overlapping with all of those things except the Democrats. They have some foothold in the institutions. They have some footholds in the Republican Party, but they're distinct. And then you've got the president. And I'm not looking to make this as a personal swipe on him. I think you said it as politely as you could. He's erratic. And I think he's increasingly erratic. I don't think many people dispute that. Like, I think we have been able to measure over the last 8 years or so, or longer, a decade, Mr. Trump is less coherent than he used to be. And you can infer from that whatever you want. And I think what we have is the United States, a series of institutions or broader political movements that are constantly trying to adapt to whatever King Trump says on any given day, and what he says on any given day often changes numerous times a day. So there's a degree of policy incoherence in the United States that is probably unavoidable. But I think on the issue of what the allies are supposed to be doing, or what the middle powers, or whatever the hell we want to call them, should be doing, I don't think any American has that figured out yet. And I think, there are parts of it I think you can make some sense of. You can understand the use of tariffs. I think it's stupid, but you can understand what they're doing. You look at that and you go, oh, okay, that's what they're doing. But then you look at the president, for example, lamenting the lack of support of allies in the Persian Gulf. Where's NATO? He keeps saying, where's NATO? Well, NATO stayed home after the president of the United States repeatedly said he didn't need them. You look at the situation in Ukraine. I don't need Zelensky's help. I have all the cards. He has no cards. Also, please send us anti-drone defenses, because our bases in the Gulf states are getting hammered by Iranian drones. And I don't know how we're supposed to deal with this. sooner or later, there's going to have to be some firming up of a new American global consensus. I just have no idea what it's going to be, and I'm not convinced it's going to be much more coherent than this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $64,000 question. Is this a temporary, madness? And there'll be an election in a few years and someone normal will come along and we'll go back sort of to where we were. I don't think that's going to happen. Or is this the kind of extreme version of the future? And, things will moderate and settle down a bit, but this is kind of where we're at. And I sort of think that's likely. And I think it's if you look at the bigger economic and political sort of indicators in the U.S., their debt is phenomenal and is growing exponentially. No one knows how they're going to ultimately deal with that. The political dysfunction is at a fever pitch on many different levels. And so I think America it's still a giant. It still bestrides the world like a colossus, as the old saying goes, but it's a wobbling giant. And it's wobbling in all kinds of different ways. And they don't know themselves, I don't think, where they're going to be on any given day. And so that's part of the uncertainty that we all live with right now. And in many ways, it's the most frightening. Trump being Trump is unpleasant, but it's also a bit clownish. But America really seriously wobbling on its feet and not, necessarily being able to be America anymore all the time, that's kind of frightening because we've all gotten used to that. That's the basis of our world. And I think that's the bigger challenge we have. I think if you sort of put aside the noise that Trump represents and the kind of clownishness and all the rest of it, America is going through a process right now. It's going to come out of the other end as something somewhat different. And we're going to have to adjust to that. It's going to affect Canada more than most because, of course, we're right next door.
So, look, you're a professor of international relations, not history, but there's a whole hell of a lot of overlap. So one of the things that I was just joking about recently with one of my American friends is that I've always loved America. Like I love Americans. I love the United States history. I love visiting the United States. But one of the truths of American history seems to be that every 100 years or so, they go bonkers. And this just seems to be the latest iteration of that. And it doesn't map out to be precisely every century, but first they went nuts and they threw all the tea in the ocean and kicked out the British. And then they killed 600,000 of each other. And then they actually had a pretty good run for the 20th century and seemed to settle down. But I think in a lot of ways, the United States is reverting.
It was that little depression.
Yeah. And the civil rights, like it wasn't all perfect and smooth, but they did seem relatively coherent. And I actually think, and this is fascinating, right? Because we were talking before we started recording that, your kids are a little bit older than mine, but we both had kids around the same age. My eldest is heading into high school. You've got one heading off to university. They're going to grow up in a world that is different, not only from mine, but from my parents and my grandparents, because they all grew up in an era where the United States was very powerful, fairly predictably friendly, and at least for my grandparents, most of their life, a global superpower. And, I've written before that, the phrase I use is that our expectations are a problem. And I don't mean that in the sense of our hopes. I mean that in what our understanding of what the facts on the ground are. It's like gravity. Imagine getting up in the morning and oops, there's no gravity today, or it's twice as much as it was yesterday, right? And like the Americans for Canadians have been a law of nature, and they're changing. I actually have a gut feeling the Americans will be back, and they'll probably be a little bit embarrassed about this, and they're going to prefer to not talk about it. But I wouldn't be shocked if that takes 20, 30, or 40 years. And we gotta survive as a country for that time. So I want to ask you two questions about Canada. What should Canada be doing? If we're not a middle power, what should we be? And what should we actually be doing?
I think we're trying to grapple with that question and we're trying to come to some consensus. And, because it's not clear where the world is going, not just America, but China and all the rest of it, it's very, very difficult to give you the answer to that question. I think we've got to be nimble and we've got to understand that as you say, the laws of gravity are changing. We don't quite know how, but we need to sort of have a few, key points in mind, one of which is that we cannot be as dependent on the U.S. as we have been, for good or bad. I mean, and in many ways, our dependence on the U.S. for the last 60, 70 years has been very good for us in terms of our, standard of living and all the rest of it. We can't just throw the Americans away. They're there, and we're going to have to live with them, but we have to find a way to engage with the world much more seriously. We have to kind of, I'm sorry to say it, grow up. And we have to understand that, we are the only ones looking out for our interests. No one else is going to. We can't give that over to someone else and just expect that they'll do the things that we need them to do because they're nice. And we need to find a constellation of countries with whom we can sort of balance the United States if it is going to be erratic for many years to come. And so it's a very, very difficult balancing act in the sense of, not sort of throwing the Americans away and saying, well, that's it, we're done with them. We can't do that. We're never going to do that. But by the same token, it's sort of, well, we can't have all our eggs in that one basket. So when it comes to things like military purchases, alliances with countries, where we sell our precious minerals and resources, how we fit into global supply chains and manufacturing. It can't just be, well, let's find out what the Americans are doing and hitch our wagon onto that. And it's very unusual for Canada. I mean, all of our history, we've either been part of the British Empire or the American Empire. We are a country that really likes to be, the junior partner in someone's empire. And maybe the time has come when that's not going to work anymore, or not to work as well as it has for us for the last 120 odd years. And we need to figure out a new way forward. And it's not going to be clean. And it's not going to be, a direct line from here to there. It's going to be a lot of stopping and starting and figuring as we go. And we have our own internal issues. Some of us in this country still believe that the American, path is the correct one for Canada, and others don't. I mean, there's a big debate going on.
I mean, I'd love to have their economic growth. I'd be happy to not have their debt, but
well, I think the two go together.
Yeah.
I think they're fueling economic growth through debt. I mean, I think you can't separate them.
I'm
not sure their economic growth is genuine.
I know. I
mean, it's real in the sense that they're growing at whatever it is, 3% or whatever, but it's not. I'm not sure it's a house of cards in some respects.
Oh, I suspect Matt Gurney has talked with our European friends about exactly that, because there are ways that we could choose to throw a few wrenches into the machinery of American governance if we so chose. So the other question I wanted to ask you is more of it's a little bit more political than the other ones. And I always hate to take a good man like you and drag him into political punditry, but I want to pose a question to you that's not partisan politics, but it's a little bit trickier than some of the others, because your essay in The Walrus, I thought was excellent. I would have reached out to you if I didn't think it was great. I also know a lot of Canadians are going to be bothered by it, because I think a lot of Canadians are very invested in the idea of Canada as a middle power. And, there are going to be people who are going to hear our conversation and they're going to think to themselves, well, what about Lester Pearson's Peace Prize? Or something, or, the kind of the other version of, well, what about Vimy Ridge? And I think that there are Canadians who are very wedded to a historical vision of what this country is or could be or should be. And I think, as you said a minute ago, I would endorse this fully. We're going to have to grow up. We're going to have to leave behind childish things. I think I just threw some scripture at you there. I'm not sure. But I think we can talk about the challenges for Canada in terms of where we buy our weapons or where we sell our products and our minerals. But there's also kind of more of a political or a social or a philosophical, maybe even a spiritual dimension to this. What the hell are we? And I think one of the reasons a lot of Canadians really rallied around the idea of the Davos speech is because middle power to us sounds comfortable and familiar. But I don't think it fits anymore. So what the hell should we be?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the issue with middle power, the issue that I had with the use of it in the Davos speech and since, is that to some extent our attachment, and I think you're right, the Canadians are attached to this idea. They hear the phrase and it's comforting, but it's also based upon a certain amount of myth. And if you look at the beginning of our middle power era, at the beginning of the Cold War in the late 1940s, one of the first people to really stand up and give a kind of an articulation of Canadian foreign policy around this idea was Louis Saint Laurent, who was at that time in 1947, he was the Secretary of State for External Affairs. He went on to become Prime Minister. And he gave a speech in Toronto where he talked about Canada's role in the world. And he didn't use the phrase middle power, but he talked about this good international citizenship and leveraging our privileged relationship with the U.S. and Britain and our economic power and all the rest of it. But he also said, but if we're going to do this right, it's going to take serious resources. We can't just do this lightly. And we forgot that. But for the 50s and 60s, I think we were one of the major contributors to NATO, and we did, put troops into peacekeeping in a serious way. But then come the 70s and 80s, we thought that just saying you're a middle power and sending a few troops overseas with blue berets on is enough. That makes you a middle power. And we sort of lost sight of the fact that, in fact, it's a serious role and it requires a serious commitment. And so we sort of leveraged it and used it to justify, withdrawing troops from NATO or at least diminishing greatly our contribution to NATO and running down the armed forces. And so one of the reasons I wrote that essay was to say, let's not get caught up in the myth of what middle power was and create a new myth and base our way in the world on a series of myths. Because if you look at, I would say, I would really recommend, maybe you can link to this, Louis Saint Laurent's 1947 speech, because it's a very good articulation of the fact that this is a serious role and it requires serious resources and you can't do it on the fly. And as I say, we progressively forgot that. So I think whatever role we aspire to in the world, and whether you call it middle power or something else, we are now in part of this business of quote unquote growing up and saying, okay, 5% for defense and defense related is, you can't do this on the cheap. If you're going to have a role in the world and you're going to be serious about it, it has costs and you have to be prepared to bear them. And that's part of, I think, what Mr. Carney is trying to communicate to Canadians. And I think right now people are hearing it. People are scared. They're worried. They don't know where this is all going. But my fear is that, things will settle down a bit and the Americans will elect someone who's seemingly a little bit more reasonable in a few years' time, and everything will sort of settle down. And then, do we really need to spend 5%? And we'll sort of go back to that. And so we need to sort of be serious about what it is we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And it's kind of like how many of us buy gym memberships and go really well for a few weeks and then they get busy and they miss one, but it's okay. They'll make it up tomorrow and then they don't. Like how long do we stay disciplined into the Rubio administration? I don't know. I honestly just don't. And, I'll let you go in a minute because I don't mean to burn your whole afternoon, but two things I would say, one of them tongue in cheek, one of them very sincere. I've been telling my colleague Jen here that I think Canada needs to lean into kind of a strategy of strategic insanity, where we just need to start acting in unpredictable ways to keep the Americans off balance. So you said a minute ago that we've always been a junior partner in an empire. Maybe we need to build an empire. Like maybe we should invade Greenland. Just keep them guessing what we're going to do next. Throw a few curveballs at them. But I think the more serious point I was going to make was kind of the notion of identity. And I was thinking when you were talking about a woman I knew a great many years ago, a wonderful woman, very nice. She was a teacher I had when I was much younger. And this was at the time when Canada was deploying as part of NATO missions troops to the Balkans because the former Yugoslavians were massacring each other and it was getting kind of uncomfortable for everybody. And Canada went in as part of the NATO missions, the stabilization forces, and we kind of called them peacekeeping missions, but it really was, at least in the opening phases, peacemaking missions. The NATO forces had to go in and separate these guys in a lot of areas and keep them apart. And there had been a report, and you'll remember this, but it was very little known by many Canadians, the Battle of the Medak Pocket, where Canadian forces actually had to get handsy and actually kinetically intervene because some of the people we were there nominally to be helping were not that happy to see us. And I remember this wonderful woman becoming visibly emotional because she was so distraught at the idea of men wearing the Canadian flag shooting at people. And I remember kind of like, I was much younger then, and I remember listening to her and thinking, oh my God, this person's a moron. And I liked her. She was a lovely person. But I was like, this woman does not know anything that she's talking about. And I remember she like calmed down and said to the class, I'm sorry, it just makes me feel so, and the word she used was icky. It makes me feel so icky to think of people being shot at by people wearing our proud flag. And I'm like, I actually think we just went and we saved a bunch of villagers from being ethnically cleansed. And I'm kind of okay with that. But I think this new world order, whatever we end up being, a middle power or regents of the occupied territory of Greenland or whatever, we're going to have to grow up. And I think that's what you said. And I hope we don't do it by leaning into new myths, but I worry that maybe we might.
Yeah. I mean, I know people who were at the Medach pocket, and they were fighting. It was a battle. It wasn't a war, but it was a battle, a serious battle. And they were told when they got home not to talk about it.
Yeah.
And DND, didn't sort of hand out any medals or recognize what had been done. It was just shh, keep it quiet. Canadians aren't ready to hear about this, But I mean, I think that is the reality now of peacekeeping. It's peace enforcement in many ways, or peacemaking, as you say. And we haven't done much of it. And, Justin Trudeau came back to power when he resumed office saying, we're going to get back to that, because that's what we did not do very much of it, because he found out very quickly that's what peacekeeping is. And so, again, this sort of middle power myth sort of took over and was allowed to, peacekeeping is standing on the line in Cyprus or in the Suez, a lightly armed force between two contestants who, agree that we should be there, just monitoring a ceasefire. And that's not the reality anymore. And so if we're going to use this sort of middle power idea as our lodestar and then link it to this mythology of what middle power actions were, we're in for a big shock, because the world isn't like that anymore. And I mean, one of the more interesting aspects of this world we live in now is that, the United States will remain, I think, the largest country in the world and the most powerful. But we're entering a phase of history where it will have a genuine competitor. I mean, the Soviet Union may have been a competitor to the United States in terms of the number of nuclear weapons, but in no other way was it really a competitor. It was a sort of an African country in terms of its economy and so on. China is not that. China is going to be a serious competitor to the United States. And so we're entering a world in which there will be an America which faces a serious competition and is itself grappling with how to deal with that. And will expect its allies to be on its side, even as it's not treating its allies like allies anymore. And that's going to be another one of our challenges, is how we square that circle, how we bring in 49,000 Chinese EVs in return for our canola sales, while at the same time supporting the United States against China. I mean, these are the kind of things we're going to be grappling with. This is just a sort of a precursor of what our foreign policy and our defense policy is going to look like for the next few decades.
Yeah, I have some preliminary concerns about that. I'll put it that way. Peter, I'll let you go here. I know you've got to get to an airport because you've got some family stuff to do, but I really appreciate this. The only thing I want to say to you is it's been a great conversation. If I'm happy to yield the floor to you, take a couple minutes if you'd like. You wrote this great essay for the Walrus. You and I are talking about what Canadians need to know. What do you, I guess that'll be my last question to you here, and you can have the last word. What is it you hope that either from your essay or from our conversation today that Canadians understand, what they take away from it?
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity. I mean, the essay, it's one of a series of essays I've written for the Walrus in the last year on defense policy and foreign policy, and really sort of looking at the world and saying, we need to think as Canadians, where do we fit? And just a sort of an automatic reliance on the United States or some other, foreign policy truisms or defense policy truisms, it's not going to cut it anymore. And I think for a whole bunch of institutions in our country which are wedded to a certain way of thinking, this is going to be very challenging. And I wrote a series of essays in the Walrus on defense policy, various, the F-35 and submarines and nuclear weapons and so on. And really saying that, our armed forces they've had 70 years of being told that the key objective is to be interoperable with the United States. As long as you have that, you can do anything. And we're entering a phase now where that's not necessarily going to be as true. It's still true in some ways, but not as true. And they're going to have to be much more flexible and adaptable. And I think, if you look at the current debate about the F-35, and many people in the Air Force, and certainly a lot of retired Air Force generals, we got to have the F-35. It's the best plane. It's the American plane. We got to have whatever the Americans have. That's a very sort of powerful imperative. And we have to start thinking through that. And, what does this world mean? And so really that was the purpose. And the article on middle power was part of that process of saying we have to question when we hear these phrases, we have to question them. And we have to say, but does that really work anymore? And if it does it work the way we thought it did? Or do we have to create a new concept of what it means? And that's really what I think the challenge we face as a country.
This episode of On the Line is also brought to you by Cameco Corporation. In nuclear energy, timelines and costs matter. Incomplete designs carry real risk of delays and cost overruns. That's why the AP1000 reactor is the right choice for Canada. It is already operating today and ready now to deliver the power we need with 100% Canadian ownership and strong participation from Canadian suppliers. If we are serious about building Canada and powering it on time and on budget, the choice is clear. The AP1000 reactor is the only option that delivers. To learn more, visit ap1000.cameco.com. That was Peter Jones of the University of Ottawa, author of that article at The Walrus. We're going to link to it in the show notes, so check that out. It's a good read. I think if you enjoyed the interview, you're going to enjoy the article. Also check out canadacompany.ca, where my first guest, Anthony Robb, and his colleagues are working to help bridge Canadian civil society and our armed forces together, particularly by helping the children of Canadians armed forces personnel who in one way or the other, made the ultimate sacrifice for this country. Thank you for joining me here on this episode. We're going to be back with you in a couple days for another episode of The Line Podcast. And I guess we'll find out if anything happens this week that we'll end up talking about. But in the meantime, www.readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe. We'll talk to you soon. Take good care.